Okay, so we're going to be doing 7.2.4, which is creating equations for sine and cosine graphs. So at the top of the screen, we have just the parent functions for sine and cosine, just as a refresher. And then keep in mind that we talked about this on our office hours today, but you can actually create a sine or cosine equation for either sine or cosine, if that makes sense. So for example, for this sine graph, if I wanted it to be in terms of cosine, I would just write y equals cosine, and then I could just shift it over to the right pi over 2, and then that would be that would become cosine. And then for cosine, if I wanted to make a sine equation, I would do the opposite by moving it over to the left, and then that would become sine. And as far as creating equations, there's technically an infinite amount, but what I like to think is do the easiest one or the most obvious. So we'll start with this one. We have again, either sine or cosine graph, but first let's answer the questions on the right. So midline. So midline is what divides the graph in half. So one way that you can easily find it is by looking at the boundary. So it goes from -3 to 1. And so if you take those two numbers, add them together, divide by 2. So -3 plus 1 is -2, divided by 2 is -1. So then that would mean that the midline is at -1. So that will be our k value. Amplitude is height above the midline. So now that we have the midline, that we could easily see the height above the midline is 2. And then as far as period, so let's say to me, when I look at this, it looks like the more obvious choice would be a sine graph. Just looking up above, it resembles that graph more closely. But again, we will end up writing both equations, but I like to do the most obvious. So the sine graph would be here. So if we find the period is how long it takes to complete one cycle. So it looks like it completes the whole cycle by 2 pi. So why it's important to know the period when you're coming up with the equation is because that will influence what your b value is. And then reflection just means, is it reflected across the x-axis? And this one is not, okay? But again, technically, we could say it's a negative sine graph if we shift it over to the right, but we're going to, again, like I said, make the most obvious equation. So first, I'm going to write it in terms of sine. So if I were to write it in terms of sine, we don't have it shifted over to the right or left because sine does start at the origin, but we do need to account for the midline and the amplitude. So in this case, the amplitude is 2. So it'd be y equals 2 sine x, and then we subtract 1 for our midline. Okay, let's say if we wanted to make this cosine. So looking at the parent graph for cosine, it starts at 1, or it starts at the highest point. So I'm going to get rid of this highlight, and now I'm going to highlight what cosine would be. So cosine should start here, and it looks like that. So it should still have the same amplitude and the same period, the same midline. The only difference is it's going to be shifted over. So in order to make this cosine, what happens is that it shifted over to the right pi over 2. So to write the cosine equation, it would be y equals 2, and then cosine, we would move this to the right pi over 2, and then you would subtract 1. Okay, so we'll go ahead and go to the next example. So you want to first pick, like, what's the most obvious? So to me, this kind of looks more, it's more looking like a cosine equation, but we'll end up writing both. But first, let's find the midline. So the highest point on the graph is 1, and the lowest point on the graph is -5. So we can add those together. -5 plus 1 is -4. Divided by 2 is 2, or -2. So our midline would be at -2, so that will be our k value. Amplitude is height above the midline, so now we can easily see that that is 3. And then the period is how long it takes to complete one cycle. So I know that cosine graph starts at the top if we look here. So we'll say it starts here and then it goes from here to here. So if we find the period, we would do 3 pi over 2 minus a negative pi over 2, which would be 4 pi over 2, which is just 2 pi. So the period is still 2 pi. As far as a reflection, we would say no. We could make it a negative graph, but like I said earlier, we're going to make the most obvious equation. So to make this a cosine equation, we would want to account for the amplitude, which would be 3. So it's going to be y equals 3. And then cosine. Now we can see that it's shifted to the left pi over 2. So we're going to do x plus pi over 2. And then the last thing that you want to do is have that midline, which is -2. Okay, let's say I want to create a sine equation. So I'm going to go ahead and erase that, and we're going to figure out what this would look like as sine. So there's actually a couple options, so we'll do 2 different ones. So sine, again, starts at that origin, and it starts like on the midline. So let's say we start here, and I go up to here to here. So that will complete the whole cycle. So if I were to write the equation for that, it would be y equals, so the amplitude is still 3, and then it would be sine. Now that is shifted to the left pi units, which makes sense because cosine is pi over 2. So this would be x plus pi and then -2. There's actually a little bit of a more obvious one. So again, I'm going to erase the highlight. And I'm going to, let's say we actually start at the origin. So we could start here, go up, come here, and finish. So if we were to do that one, then this would be y equals. Now that is just a negative sine graph and it has no horizontal shift. So I was telling you guys earlier, you can make any graph be a negative amplitude, but that would just change the horizontal shift. In this case, it would make the horizontal shift nothing. So this would just be -3 sine x and then -2. All right, last one here. So this one's a little bit tricky. We can hopefully some of us can kind of tell automatically that this will not have a period of 2 pi. So first thing is figure out our midline. So the highest point is 2 and the lowest point is 0. So if we add those together and divide by 2, we get 1. So that means that our midline is 1. So our midline is 1. Amplitude is height above the midline. So in this case, the height above the midline is just 1. The period. So to me, this looks more like a sine graph, but we're going to do both. So let's say it's a sine graph. It starts on the midline. It's actually going down and it comes here, here, here. So that completes one cycle. So to find the period, we can see that it completes that entire cycle in pi units. Okay, and then the reflection, then it would have a reflection because it's going downwards. So to come up with the equation, this will have a b value. So remember, to find the period, we know the period is 2 pi over b. So 2 pi over b in this case, we know has to be pi. So then therefore b has to be 2. So we're going to need that information for when we write the equation. So if I were to write this in terms of sine, it would be y equals negative sine. Now my b value is 2x, and then I have my midline of 1. All right, now I'm going to unhighlight this and write it in terms of cosine. So if I want to make this a cosine graph, I would say we start here and then come back up. So to find the period, we know it's going to be the same, but it would be 3 pi over 4 and then minus negative pi over 4, which would end up still being pi. So to write this equation, we would do y equals, it's a positive cosine. It still has a b value of 2, but what's happened is it's shifted to the left by pi over 4. So we're going to do x plus pi over 4, and then it still has our midline of 1. Okay, so this is a bit confusing because, like I said, there's many different options, but I want you to think about coming up with the most obvious or easiest equation for these graphs. And so I personally think you should almost always do sine and cosine, but if we were to do this on an assessment, I would tell you whether to do sine or cosine.